first, there are ways in which we need to contextualize our understanding of poverty. So estimates of poverty in 2022 at least sort of note that they've returned to 2019 levels, and there's roughly about 682 million people that are in poverty throughout the world. But this is extreme poverty, so there are definitely more people who are in poverty beyond, that are above the extreme level. Specific to the United States, it's roughly about 37.9 to 42.1 million people who are in poverty, 12 million of which are children. But I think what's important to think about poverty besides those numbers is the question of how do we see poverty? Is it something that an external force produces, or is it something that is based upon the behaviors of individuals, basically the people who are in poverty? I think that's always been the constant debate because many programs are geared towards intervention, and they're thinking that the person themselves have some type of responsibility as it relates to poverty, as opposed to external forces that produce the circumstances that the people live in poverty. But when we think about policies and practices within the field of leisure studies, let's look at first the fact that it's not an area that we research or discuss. So across multiple leisure journals, so that's including World Leisure Journal, Journal of Leisure Research, Leisure Sciences, Annals of Leisure Research, Lozier Leisure Studies, there's only been one article that's ever been published on poverty eradication. Now, I'm making the distinction that there's been articles that's on poverty, whether it's just discussing the state of poverty for certain populations or poverty alleviation, so reducing the fees that a person may need to sort of spend to enter a recreation center and so forth. But poverty reduction is not that. Poverty eradication is, as it means, completely getting rid of it. And so there's only been one article in the entire history of all those journals that has been on poverty eradication, and it was Yalo 2012 in World Leisure Journal. So that's pretty much an indictment on the leisure field for not treating this as a subject matter worthy of discussion or research. But the additional thing has been for me looking at all the various cities in the United States that have 1 million or more people, and looking at the Parks and Recreation Department. These are governmental agencies that provide swimming and summer camp and other types of events and so forth for their respective residents and tourists who may come to those cities. And in each of those cities in the United States that have, again, 1 million or more people, not one of them has in their mission statement even the word poverty. So I think those two things combined, how the journals have not treated poverty reduction as a topic, and the fact that there's been no agency that has poverty in its mission, does give a very sobering, if not maybe depressing, sort of criticisms on the field of leisure studies. I think we may have to stop thinking about leisure as a solution to everything. And so one of the important things is to consider that when we want to deal with poverty eradication, there may not be a leisure solution to poverty eradication, meaning the creation of a program, the creation of policies that are tied to providing leisure. Just by nature, that doesn't sound even like something that could actually happen or even exist. Not to say that nobody's trying that, but so one of the things that I've started to think about, even through my own research through geography, has been to think about ways in which is leisure a producer of poverty? Does it help to expand poverty? And so if it does, what are some ways in which we could prevent those things that help to produce or expand poverty through leisure? Can we remove those? And so I see three different categories in which leisure is a producer of poverty. So one is wages, the second is capital campaigns, and the third is what's known as organized abandonment. So to explain each of those three, when we think about wages, many of the jobs that people have that are tied to the wage are in sectors of sport, tourism, events, hospitality, as an example, throughout the world. Specifically to the United States, there's been a long-standing push amongst wage workers to increase the minimum wage from various levels, from $7 or $9 to $15, making the argument that this is to try to create a livable wage. But even if these striking workers succeed in getting $15 an hour, $15 in New York is not the same thing as $15 in St. Louis, and $15 in St. Louis is not the same thing as $15 in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so what one can do with $15 really depends upon their geographic location. But also the additional thing is that there's oftentimes more employment opportunities in the cities where the $15 wouldn't be enough. So there's far more hotels to work at in New York. But that also means that your wage will not be enough to do much of anything. What they estimate is that $33 in New York City would just be the beginning of a livable wage, meaning that a person by themselves could actually earn the income from the job that they're working and enjoy simple things in life, like maybe once a month go to a movie theater or put some money to the side to go to school and go through an advanced degree program. But other than that, without that $33, anything less than that, we're talking about cuts to those aspects of life. And, this is also hoping that the person remains healthy, because the cost of medical care and these types of things begin to chip away even at the $33. So wage is one of the things that maybe we could be better at aiding workers throughout the world, especially in the hospitality industry or sectors of leisure, to get better wages, not just fair wages, but beyond fair wages, since these things like events and so on are so important to community cohesion, revenue generation for the city, and so forth. So that's wages. The second area I mentioned was capital campaigns. And capital campaigns are what we sort of think about as large amounts of money that are put towards constructing something of use for the city, bridges, highways, interstates. But capital campaigns can also be what cities use to build stadiums for Olympics and World Cups and other major sporting events. Capital campaigns can also be for stadium construction specifically, not even associated with those major games. What we do know is that there's been a repeated history with those capital campaigns of displacement, meaning that the money that's put towards constructing, in that process of constructing, there's displacement that's caused. That happens because of constructing that stadium or holding that event. And so there's been many throughout history. One of the more horrendous examples in the United States, specifically to the Los Angeles Dodgers, one of their early or older stadiums, when they came to California, which was the building of the stadium on top of the neighborhood area called Chavez Ravine. Chavez Ravine was pretty much a neighborhood area filled with Mexican-American homeowners, because this was one of the few places that the racism of Los Angeles would allow them to even build their homes. So it was not desirable land until this project came to be. And so in the course of 10 years, 1951 to 1961, the city steadily forcibly moved these people out. And when I say forcibly, I mean police entering homes, physically removing people out of their homes, bulldozers then knocking down the homes, not even giving people sometimes a chance to gather their belongings, and they were never compensated. So 1,800 families roughly were removed from Chavez Ravine just to build a stadium. Then we have other examples that are even more egregious. In 1959 in St. Louis, there was a neighborhood area called Mill Creek Valley, which is near the downtown area, and city developers wanted to create what was known as Park Plaza. So it'll be a massive city park alongside housing and so forth, upscale housing. And they moved 20,000 people who lived in Mill Creek Valley in the span of 4 days. And similar to Chavez Ravine, there are elements of race, within this, because the majority of those residents in Mill Creek Valley were Black, African American. And so, again, in 4 days to build this park. And what's even worse in this particular case is the city never even constructed Park Plaza. So after they spent $11 million in demolition, I mean, just the monies that were for demolition, the dynamite and the bulldozers and the gasoline to run the bulldozers, that cost $11 million. That $11 million could have been used for that neighborhood area. But even after they finally leveled the area, they never followed through with the plans. And it's only been in the more recent time, in the past 10 years, that even any parts of Mill Creek Valley has begun to be even developed into something. So it was an unnecessary displacement because it was never acted upon. For the 1996 Atlanta Games, Olympic Games, something like 30,000 primarily Black residents of Atlanta were displaced for the games, both before the games started, during the games, and then a little bit afterwards. But alongside even their removal, something like 9,000 people who were unhoused, who were residing in tents and camps in the city, they were arrested over this period of time. So we can see how capital campaigns, again, especially for leisure, because there's other capital campaigns that does this too, but capital campaigns specifically to leisure creates displacement and worsens poverty. Also, classically, we have the history of Robert Moses, who was a park commissioner in New York for 75 years, and during one 44-year period of that 75-year run that he was a park commissioner, he helped to displace like 250,000 people over his career to build 2 World's Fairs, 160 odd playgrounds, beach areas, and so forth, as well as expressway. So that's capital campaigns. And lastly, there's what I call organized abandonment, but it's not my term. Peter Drucker is from management, and organized abandonment is a sort of idea to how do you increase revenues or move revenues to pay for new projects when you're not bringing in the type of revenue that you need. So after you've cut wages of workers and you've increased prices for goods that you're selling, how do you get the money? And so Peter Drucker devised this sort of tactic in which you can cut your resources that you use for one part of your organization. So if we think about some of us work within office buildings where maybe during a holiday period they turn off the heat to sort of reduce the cost. That floor that doesn't have any heat would be an example of organized abandonment. So you shut down resources so that then the monies that would go towards that could go to something else. The sad thing, though, is that people have adopted that management technique that you may see in a building to a city. And so organized abandonment then would mean that there are neighborhood areas that no longer are getting the services that they need, so that then those monies are then diverted to other things. So this is where we see in certain cities, if they're in a certain climate in which there's snow, that neighborhood area may not get snow removal, um, or that part of the city wouldn't get new street lights. That would be an example of organized abandonment. So then, where does that money go? And so what we see is a lot of times that there's a will to clearly not eradicate poverty, but to do something else, to accumulate more wealth, to generate more revenue streams. And so we can see specifically in the United States this constant use of public funds for leisure sites. So in 2014, in the city of Detroit, something like $285 million of public funds was used to help construct the Detroit Red Wings Stadium, a hockey team that's famous in the United States. 2015 for the Dallas Cowboys, their stadium used something like 325 million public funds. And then in 2018, we can see examples of, for the New York Yankees, a combination of public money as well as tax breaks amounted to something like $1.18 billion for the construction of the New York Yankees Stadium. We can just keep going on and on. The more recent example in 2023 is the Tennessee Titans in Nashville. Their city council approved $1.3 billion for the construction of the new stadium. And so at this particular point, that's the most money. And this is not even tax breaks. This is just an outright use of public funds, $1.3 billion. So this is the largest use of public funds so far for stadium construction. And so we know that those monies are clearly being taken from somewhere else because tax dollars from residents aren't increasing. You know, there's not like 100,000 more people move to Nashville, Tennessee. So these are funds that are sitting there from people's property taxes and the income taxes that could have gone to neighborhood parks and schools and other things, but instead they've been sort of compiled for the construction of the Tennessee Titans Stadium. And then with each of those three, we can just think about that there are also even problems with solutions to some of these problems. So green gentrification, the notion that sustainable practices can also create displacement. And so we see this especially with the redevelopment of maybe bus lines with electric buses, solar paneling, but even more specifically, when cities have taken old railroad lines that are elevated and turned them into linear parks. And while these are sort of wonderful ideas, and we can think about the ways in which people now utilize those parks, the thing is that the property values of the homes increase that are nearby. And so people who are on fixed income or have lower income, but they own their home, can now no longer cover the cost of the taxes to stay in their home, or their utilities increase, and so they can't afford the new water bill or the new heating bill. And so again, those three areas are wages, capital campaigns, and organized abandonment. And so for us, maybe it's not about trying to find a leisure solution to poverty eradication. Maybe it's about finding the ways to prevent leisure from being a producer of poverty. So yeah, at North Carolina State University, where I'm a professor at and also department head, I have a great opportunity to work with a number of faculty that are thinking about these things more deeply. And so similar to some of the responses I've already given is that there may be need to what's called decentering leisure, so not making leisure the focus, but other things the focus and how they may relate to leisure. And so I have faculty that are doing wonderful work and thinking about transportation access both to parks, but also in the city in general, because we know that transportation lines, especially depending upon the city, may not be distributed to all neighborhoods fairly. Places like New York may be a little bit different, where there's a culture of public transportation really being for the entire public, regardless of income and jobs. But there are other parts of the United States in which public transportation has a stigma of being tied to the poor. And so people don't want to expand public transportation, or they don't really want it to, they don't want to be on the bus with somebody who's identified as poor. So again, I have colleagues who look at transportation equity, transportation access. I also have faculty that thinks about the ways in which air quality is vastly different depending upon the neighborhood and its sort of design. So, what areas of a city has a lot of concrete, and what other areas of the city has a lot of green space, and what happens with the air quality depending upon not just that design, but also what happens in those areas. So, in the area of a lot of concrete, there's also a lot of industrial truck movement. There's also issues of maybe toxic facilities or waste facilities in those areas. And so, again, I have colleagues who are working on that. But for myself, I look at both history as well as in the present day. And so cities and how they're sort of designed and planned is very fundamental to my understanding and my criticisms or ways in which I analyze things. And so historically, I think about how cities have been influenced by colonial management of different locations, and how that management of those settlements in those different sort of colonies then became important city planning techniques in general. So they brought those abilities to create the city grid and so on back to the home country, and they also use other techniques of neighborhood separation and how different populations would be sort of restricted to different neighborhood areas. That was something that was perfected in the colonies, and they brought that to cities. So Mexico City ended up influencing, Barcelona, and these types of things emerge. Or a New York influences London. So that's important historically, but then in the present day, how are those historic structures still maintained? But so in terms of the neighborhoods, and most people may not even realize, especially for depending upon how old the city is, how long a certain neighborhood has had the same sort of economic makeup, or religious or ethnic makeup. Going back hundreds of years. But the other part is how then those old techniques are still brought into the modern day. So when we think about organized abandonment may be a new term, but we can see some of those practices having been applied to Bogota, and as well as in Toronto, just again, depending upon where. We also see, unfortunately, police practices, and so poverty is very much associated with increased incarceration, increased arrests, and so how police are deployed to certain neighborhoods. So, for example, the very idea of crime statistics is even a misnomer, just like poverty intervention. And what I mean by that, especially in the United States, is that we don't really truly have crime statistics. What we have is arrest statistics that are then used as crime statistics, because there's a book of all types of crime, but the city is not mapping every single type of crime. They're only mapping maybe 8 to 9 types of crime only. So murder, arson, and these other types of crime, like maybe money laundering, aren't mapped. And then we can then see which type of criminal is then mapped, right? Like the person who steals $2 million from public funds, we're not thinking about that person, but we're thinking about the person who, unfortunately is holding a gun to somebody and trying to mug them on the street. And so what we have is arrest statistics because these are locations in which police are deployed to arrest. And at least in the United States, they keep deploying people to the exact same location. So then that helps to then create a sort of myth of crime is only happening in one part of the city, because it literally is just something in which we're not deploying the police to all types of crime. So again, how geography, how cities are sort of laid out, how they're planned both in the past and how they're planned in the present is very much a part of my work. Yeah, for myself, I have been a DJ for a number of years. This is since 1984. People don't really need to know how old I am, but they can probably assume that from 1984, coming from Chicago and seeing the birth of house music and being part of that period of time. And I still DJ. I don't DJ as often, but that nightlife, that notion of nightlife has always allowed me to sort of see another part of the city, see the use and deployment of law enforcement in a certain way, in a selective way, like which streets would there be an alcohol driver check and which streets would there not be. When I DJ for maybe queer or gay clubs, how unsafe the patrons were when the party let out, because there was no protection for those patrons, but for a well-off party or club, there would be protections afterwards, sitting in the parking lot and so forth. So nightlife has always sort of given me another sort of insight about the city. One of the more recent things tied to nightlife that has been really puzzling, but it's also part of this notion of the will that we have, the will that we don't have for poverty eradication, but the will that we have to apply to other things. And what I do know is more recently in Berlin, there's been 900 million euros has been assigned to grow the nightlife of Berlin. So making or building clubs, renovating existing clubs, paying for higher priced DJs, spending money on festivals. This is all strictly for nightlife. And this is all in one city. This is not 900 million for the entire country of Germany. This is just 900 million for one city. And while I know that there are DJs who are, excited about this opportunity, it just tells me, again, how there is no will for certain things and there's will for other things. And while I'm sure that there will be some monies or some parts of these monies that may go to jobs, that gets back to our wage point. How much money will these people have? Will they, will a bouncer at a club and earn enough money as a livable income where they don't have to work a second job? Or is it just going to go to the owners of the clubs or the people who own the property in which the club is sort of housed? But again, 900 million euros towards nightlife is just an astonishing thought. And the fact that we can't find monies that are available for any sort of type of poverty programming, much less poverty eradication.